Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Read Fundamentals. I'm Carissa, and this is Resilience Part 1. So, this is part of a two-part series for resilience. This is going to lay the foundation for all the rest of our trainings when we're talking about mental health, self-care, anything like that. Resilience is really the foundation and the basis for why we are building and working on those things. Okay, so let's get into this a bit. I want you guys to get comfortable and engage in the learning. I know right now we don't have a face-to-face class. But I do want us to take the time to write down our thoughts and comments in the discussion, and I will engage with you as well there to answer any questions that might arise from this training or anything that comes to mind that you would like to see more training on. So some of our objectives for today's lesson are to define what resilience is. We're going to explore a brief history of resilience research, understand three main pathways towards resilience, and then identify personal traits of resilience or what a resilient person would embody. So, what is resilience? And resilience is defined as an individual's capacity to withstand and recover quickly in the face of significant trauma. So the term that came to mind for me was positive adaptation. We want to make sure when we are thinking of being resilient or recovering from a trauma that we are moving towards something that is going to help us while we adapt to a situation. This is important because positive is the key word here. And I want us to actually define that word so that we're not operating from a subjective standpoint. When we define the term positive, we get terms such as optimistic, productive, helpful, and practical. When we define adapt, we get modify, adjust, and new purpose. So, in essence, resilience is the ability to adjust in a productive, optimistic way in the face of adversity. Okay, so we can always adapt, but it's not always in a positive way. So, that's why I say adaptation, because to adapt just means to modify, right? When we're looking at the definition. So, if I adapt in the face of a trauma, that might not always bring me something that is helpful to my future or productive and not optimistic, because optimistic means we have hope for the future. So if I'm responding or reacting just to adjust my thoughts or processes about what happened to me, what am I experiencing, it might not always help me be successful in the future. So we want to make sure when we're thinking of resilience, when we think of all that we do for mental health and self-care, it's so that we can be optimistic, keep our heads up about it, be productive, so forging forward, and doing things that are helpful to enhance our future. And they have to be practical, something that we can actually accomplish. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about some scientific research behind the idea of resilience. I'm going to really skirt the surface on this topic. I'm not going to dive super deep. I just want to kind of give you some understanding that this topic has been researched and it's not just something that's a key phrase that's being thrown around. There is some merit to it. Scientists from a variety of different disciplines, such as psychology, sociology, neurology, have been researching this concept of resilience for years. Many of them want to try to discover that secret recipe to overcoming. How are people being able to bounce back from adversity And then when we're looking in comparison, that not everyone is successful with that. So this became a really important topic, especially in psychology and sociology to begin with, because we were looking at how the social constructs and our psychological constructs are helping us to become more resilient. How are we using our tools and resources to bounce back? And why are some people not as successful as others in this area? So, when we look at early research on the topic of resilience, we can see that they began to discuss this topic focusing on personality traits. It focused on the selective strengths that a person had that they could use to survive adversity. Because we wanted to know if they're naturally more resilient, it has to be something that the individual embodies on their own without assistance. So the slogan from the Maybelline commercial is what came to me when reading this, and the maybe she's born with it. Maybe resilience is something that some people come out of the womb ready to go and face the world in a way and with a perspective that is more advanced than other people. After looking specifically at personality traits in early research, some studies begin to emerge that try to take a more holistic look at different things that could impact a person, adversities that they could face, and then looking at how they could respond to it and the lasting impact that experiencing those adversities could have on their lives. One of the more notable studies that came out was one that was conducted by the CDC and Kaiser in 1995 through 1997. So, this is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs study. Now, this came out and it was all the buzz. And I'm going to give you a few high level statistics that we want to kind of keep in mind as we think of resilience and adversity in itself. Because although I'm not going to go super deep into ACEs unless you guys request it, I'll be more than happy to make a separate video on it if you would like. I just want to highlight some of the takeaways from that emerged from this study. Okay. Now, this study investigated the links between childhood abuse and neglect and household challenges on a person's health and well-being into adulthood. Okay. Some of the things that came out of this is that and 67% of the population had at least one ACE. I really like that this diagram that I found on Anne Marie's project, because I feel like they did a really great job of putting together this information into this pictograph so that we can see how much information was extracted from this research study. And to know that 67% of people that are around us have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience in their lifetime is really staggering, right? When we look at it even further, what came out of this study, we find that 1 in 5 reported 3 or more ACEs in their lifetime as a child. So when we're looking at this, this is actually very reassuring, and it tells us that our neighbors, our peers, our colleagues have more than likely experienced trauma and are striving to overcome it. Now, this is not great that people are going through things, but what is reassuring about it is that we are not alone. When we're talking about trauma, trauma can be very isolating as an experience, especially as a child. It makes us feel like no one else in the world could possibly understand a fraction of what we're going through. And to see that a vast number of people are struggling to overcome trauma makes the topic of resilience that much more important. It's imperative that we understand how we can continue to grow and be productive despite the events that we have experienced as children, as teenagers, and even into our adulthood. And we look a little bit further at some of the categories that were captured in this study to yield those statistics we just saw. In the category of abuse, we see that they looked at emotional abuse, they measured physical abuse as well as sexual abuse. Household challenges that were measured are the treatment of the mother, whether she was treated violently, substance abuse in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, incarcerated household members. In neglect, they measured emotional neglect as well as physical neglect. Okay, so these are some of the things that were captured in this study that people have said they have went through as children. They've lived in a household where the mother was experiencing domestic violence, where there was sexual abuse in the household, where they felt physically and emotionally neglected, parents being separated, tearing the house apart, incarcerated household members, people that they're close to, those bonds, or just witnessing how reckless and crazy it can be to be involved with police and custody. So these are the things that our peers, our neighbors, our friends, and our family are experiencing. And this ACE study just revealed to us some of the things that we've already kind of known, but didn't really want to acknowledge. And that is that we really need to pay attention to our mental health, and that so many people around us are experiencing these traumas and need help. And also we need to give them that grace and understanding and say, hey, look, so many of us are going through this, and we need to kind of work together to help build each other up and help us get through this and help us recover. Finally, the ACEs study, I'm just going to briefly go over some of the lasting impacts of it. So far from this study, we've seen statistics that are kind of staggering, right? There's so many people in our very communities are experiencing traumas in our childhoods that are impacting us now into our adult lives. And so we want to now, as we embrace each other, as we embrace the reality of this, see what those lasting impacts are. So when we are interacting with our peers, because we don't know who they are that have experienced these things, that we are doing it with being informed. So trauma informed care. We want to care for the people around us with a heart of grace and also just kindness towards them, because you never know who is going through something and what they might have experienced. So some of the lasting impacts that you could see from someone who has experienced significant childhood experiences that were adverse are injury. So traumatic brain injury, fractures, or burns. And I'm going to read this to you because I believe this diagram is a little bit small. I got this off of the CDC website, and I'm going to leave some links as well so that you can dive further into this at your leisure if you so choose to. But yeah, so back to this. I'm going to read. So injury, so traumatic brain injury, fractures, or burns. Someone could also experience mental health disorders. So things such as depression, anxiety, suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Maternal health can be impacted. So unintended pregnancies, pregnancy complications, and even fetal death. Infectious diseases such as HIV and STDs, or sexually transmitted diseases. Chronic disease, so we're talking about cancer and diabetes. Risk-taking behaviors for drug and alcohol abuse or unsafe sex, which can then lead back to the HIV, AIDS, so those infectious diseases, or unintended pregnancies. And finally, adverse childhood experiences can impact people's education, occupation, and income potential. Okay? So these are the things I just want you to kind of open your mind and your heart to, um, as you interact with people around you and understand the importance of this topic, that, research has shown us and shed light on the fact that so many of us are dealing with trauma. Okay? So I want us to kind of take a more personal look at this and start to think of someone that's close to us that we believe to be resilient. So take a moment. We all know that person that we've gone, this person is so strong, man. They've gone through XYZ and have really bounced back. And so I want you to think of that person, hold them in your mind, and what are some of the terms that come to mind? And I know I've thrown out a few since we began this training. I just want you to kind of get a gauge for what are those terms that you would use. So strong, right? This person is really strong. They're tough. They're irrepressible. They're flexible and adaptive. So these are some of the terms that I'm sure you guys have a few more. You can write them in the description bar in the comment section, and I will, add them to our presentation in the future. But these are some of the terms that people use to describe a person that they find to be resilient. When we go back to the question, are people naturally more resilient than others? We can see that this is not an easy answer. It's very complex. So many different ways a person can experience trauma, and just as many ways, if not more, that a person can have interact with how they address the trauma they have experienced. So the simple answer, though, is yes. Yes, there are traits and qualities that a person can embody that can increase the likelihood that that person will recover more quickly from the impact of trauma. Okay. The more complex answer is that trauma and resilience is a complex interaction between a person's personal attributes, their biology, and the social context in which the trauma or event has been experienced. So we're talking about the nature of the adverse experience or event, like what happened to them, okay? The number of events that occurred, how many times did this happen to them, the intensity of the event, and the persistence of experiencing this type of trauma. So when we're thinking of that, let's use an example of poverty or violence within the community. Okay. How often is this person experiencing the state of poverty? How often do they experience trauma of violence in the community? Is it daily? Do they hear gunshots going off? Or is it just that one time that they saw someone get shot dead in the street, but it never happened again? That's still traumatic and it still sits with a person. But the intensity, persistence, and number of events that have occurred are significantly less than a person who lives with chronic violence on every street corner, nightly gunshots. That will impact a person on a different level of intensity. Okay, so that's what we mean when we're talking about the social context of the adverse event. Okay, there are three main pathways to resilience, and they interact with each other. Okay, so these pathways include the personal, environmental, systemic, and biological. For now, we're going to stick with the personal. I'm going to make additional follow-up videos to address the environmental, systemic, and biological factors. Personal is going to take us a little bit more time because, one, this is something we can readily address. It is us. So this is how research began, and this is how we should begin our journey to address things that are within our sphere of control. So let's dive more into what each one of these groups encompasses briefly, and then we're going to take a quick look at the personal before we wrap up this presentation. Okay? So when we look at each three of these circles, we can see personal traits, genetic and biological, environmental, systemic factors. Okay, I'm going to briefly read through them in case you can't see it for whatever reason. So when we're talking about personal traits that a person embodies that helps them be more resilient, we're talking about things such as optimism, control of self, emotional awareness, self-concept, self-esteem, self-efficacy, and problem-solving skills. Okay? Genetic and biological is going to address things such as brain development, brain functioning, and other neurobiological systems. Finally, we see our environmental. So we have our micro, which means our units of people we interact with that are close to us, or macro on a larger scale, so things that are around us in our community that we interact with as well. So on a macro level, on a micro level, we have relationships with our family and peers, our supportive circles such as teachers and other adults in our lives. And then for macro, the school systems we interact with, cultural factors we interact with, our community services and resources available to us, and the lack of violence in the communities and areas that we reside. Okay. I'm going to take a second to step back to personal traits. I do want to give a quick overview of the selves. And I know if you're not familiar with the difference between the three, you're probably like, why are you repeating this? Okay. But for those that are great, for those who are not, I'm going to briefly go through them. So they are distinctly different, although some people do use them interchangeably. Self-concept is basically your understanding or knowledge of yourself. Okay, it's neither good nor bad. What the trait is, you're just acknowledging who you are as an individual. Okay, for example, I can say I talk a lot. Not good or bad, I'm just telling you. That's just something that is a part of me. It's a trait that I possess. If I say I have talk about my self-esteem, that's when I start to attribute positive or negative qualities to the trait that I have. Okay. So if I say I talk a lot and it makes me depressed and I feel sad about it because of how people treat me when they're around me and I'm talking, now it start to affect how I feel about that trait and in essence how I feel about myself. Okay, will soon follow that. If I don't feel like the qualities I possess are more positive than negative, my esteem, how I feel, how highly I think of myself will start to be diminished. And you can see this especially when you're talking about things that really are a part of a person's identity, right? I really define myself by this trait. And when people don't accept me for this trait or quality, I now feel less than. Okay. And finally, self-efficacy is the belief that you can accomplish and do something or a task. Okay. I believe I can do this because I have these great qualities. Even in spite of the terrible qualities that I'm working on with Jesus, I can overcome this. I can do this. That's self-efficacy. All right. So you have the drive. You have to push. I'm motivated. I can do this. I got this. Okay. And as you can see so far from me describing what these three terms are, how they really play a great part into building resilience and bouncing back from adversity. Okay, final slide, guys. Thanks for hanging in there. You've made it through the first part of this resilience training. So I hope some of this has been really informative for you guys. And for those who were aware of it, I hope you did get something at least remotely new from it or a refresher of some ideas that you were taught in the past. I'm going to briefly just read through these personal traits, and we're going to, in the interest of time, we're going to stop this here, and then we're going to pick it up in part 2 and dive a little bit deeper into each one of these areas. Okay? So personal traits that a person embodies that is resilient is openness, extroversion, active coping or coping skills. Sorry, that one's cut off. Social attachment, emotional regulation, spirituality, resourcefulness, and adaptability. Okay? So, like I said, part 2, we are going to jump in, pick up, and go into each one of these as well as the personal traits from the previous slide. And we're going to just talk a little bit more about what each one of these means for us and how we can tap into them to improve even further on our resilience. Okay. All right, guys. Well, thank you once again for going through this training, and I look forward to talking to you in the next one. Have a good day.